Hello, I'm Jordan, and kind of my core reading project of 2021 was to work my way through the King James Bible, which I did. And I just finished the New Testament about a week ago, and I wanted to make a little video discussing my thoughts on it. I did do a video about 6 months ago about on my thoughts on the Old Testament, and I'll link that down below. And I will say, well, I'll start off by just saying I feel like you can kind of divide the New Testament into three distinct sections. So there's the Gospels, there's the Epistles, and then there is the Book of Revelations. And I'll start off by talking about um, the Gospels, of course, and then kind of how they relate to the Epistles, especially the Epistles of Paul. Um, so, well, I guess I should say first of all that I don't think that at least in this translation, the famous King James translation, I don't think that the New Testament is nearly as beautiful or as resonant or as just affecting as a literature as the Old Testament was. I often found myself missing kind of the very, very weird but powerful language that you find in the Old Testament, as well as the stories. There's only one story in the New Testament, really, although it's told four different ways, unless you count the book of Acts, which I'm not really going to talk much about. But that's the story, of course, of Jesus, the story of the Gospels. And I will say that Jesus, despite the fact that these books of the New Testament aren't nearly as engaging as literature, in my opinion, as the Old Testament, Jesus is perhaps the most interesting character in all of the Bible. That's mostly because he's such an enigmatic character. I could never quite figure out what to make of him as a person, as a character, and I'm assuming that's largely the reason for his veneration and his controversy throughout the millennia. And I'll just stress again here, I should have said this at the beginning, I'm reading this entire book, the Bible, as literature, just not to disrespect anyone's religious views on this book at all. It is a beautiful book. I cannot blame anyone for founding a religion on it, and I'm not adverse to that idea at all. I'm just saying I read this as literature, so keep that in mind. I will be talking about it as literature. I will be talking about Jesus as a character. So anyways, he is a very, very, very enigmatic character. He seems to have cultivated that persona in the fact that he speaks almost entirely in riddles and entirely in parables. In ways that aren't easily resolvable, or they're often quite impenetrable, the parables. They often seem to be non sequiturs, and even when they're not non sequiturs, they are open to endless interpretation, I would say. But beyond that, Jesus is very distinct depending on who you're reading. You know, Matthew, Mark, what have you, John or Luke. He is often portrayed as nothing more than, in my opinion, nothing more than a magician or an exorcist, as in like the Gospel of Mark seems to portray him just largely as a kind of sorcerer or an exorcist. Really, he only shines as a preacher, Rabbi Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, which is my personal favorite of the Gospels because it has the most of Jesus' actual teachings. Much of the Gospels and much of the New Testament are not focused on Jesus' teachings, really, in my experience, in my reading. They're focused on Jesus as the way to the kingdom of God, not through his teachings, but through himself and through his sacrifice. So it was interesting to see what his actual teachings are, as impenetrable as they can be. But as I said, a deeply fascinating character, and I think that moving into the epistles, Paul took that deeply fascinating character and did very interesting things with it, because Paul is another one of the most interesting characters in the Bible, both as an actual character in Acts and as a writer of letters in the epistles. As a character in Acts, he is, I think, the kind of the core protagonist of the book of Acts, and his story is entertaining in a way that I didn't expect it to be, in that in the book of Acts he seems to have a kind of legalistic mindset. He equivocates the gospel into the world of the Gentiles in a very, very interesting kind of I don't want to say slimy, it's not slimy, but in a very cunning kind of way, the way he dodges certain issues in order to get the gospel spread. Um, and then as far as his epistles go, they are often quite also impenetrable, but they're also uh, problematic at times, and they're also very beautiful at times. He's very much of a mixed bag, and you do get the sense that he is writing um, as with a kind of legalistic mind frame. I feel like I'm not explaining this very well, but you get the sense that he is an apologist. So he's making these arguments, trying to weave his way around the various worldviews and lifestyles of the people who he's trying to essentially not convert, but essentially teach how to worship properly, with very mixed results. I think it's fair to say he had a towering intellect, but I also think that he does some questionable things with the actual story of Jesus as we have it in the Gospels. And to illustrate that, I'm actually going to cheat and give you a little quote. As I was reading the King James Bible, I was also reading The Shadow of a Great Rock, which is Harold Bloom's book on the King James Bible. This is not a great book. I'd say it's at least 50% quotes, just directly quoting from the King James Bible. It's very, very thin. But when he does talk about something in depth, it's very, very good. But even in this quote I'm going to give you, it's not from Harold Bloom. This is George Bernard Shaw being quoted by Harold Bloom, talking about Jesus in relation to Paul. So it's a bit of a long passage, but I very much agree with it. So he says, talking about Paul, he is no more a Christian than Jesus was a Baptist. He is a disciple of Jesus only as Jesus was a disciple of John. He does nothing that Jesus would have done and says nothing that Jesus would have said, though much like the famous Ode to Charity that he would have admired. He is more Jewish than the Jews, more Roman than the Romans, proud both ways, full of startling confessions and self-revelations that would not surprise us if they were slipped into the pages of Nietzsche, tormented by an intellectual conscience that demanded an argued case, even at the cost of sophistry, with all sorts of fine qualities and occasional illuminations, but always hopelessly in the toils of sin, death, and logic, which had no power over Jesus. As we have seen, it was by introducing this bondage and terror of his into the Christian doctrine that he adapted it to the church and state systems which Jesus transcended, and made it practicable by destroying the specifically Jesuist, having to do with Jesus, that is, the specifically Jesuist side of it. He would have been quite in his place in any modern Protestant state, and he, not Jesus, is the true head and founder of our Reformed Church, as Peter is of the Roman Church. The followers of Paul and Peter made Christendom, while the Nazarenes were wiped out. That's a little harsh, I think, and I understand that Paul plays a central role in the Christian faith, and I have no problem with that, but I do think that there is a dissonance between what Paul is saying and what you get in the story of Jesus, at least as he is portrayed in Matthew and Luke. In Mark and John, it's a little more understandable, especially in John. Jesus comes across as kind of a philosopher rather than a preacher. He's very, very metaphysical in John, I think. So in that sense, he transitions a little more smoothly into Paul, which perhaps makes sense because I understand that John was the gospel that was written latest, I think like 60 years after Jesus' death. But moving on to, first of all, keeping that dissonance in mind, I'll move on to the book of Revelations, which is dissonant in a different way. It's dissonant in that I feel like it is desperately trying to kind of recreate the magic that you find in the prophets of the Old Testament, and failing. I don't think that the book of Revelations is interesting reading at all. It's a lot of nonsense and not any kind of powerful, moving, terrifying nonsense that you find in the prophets of the Old Testament. So the book of Revelations was the biggest disappointment of the New Testament to me. But that brings me to the larger point here, which is that in my reading, the New Testament is very, very much an interpretation or a commentary on the Old Testament. It is constantly referring back to the Old Testament, not just in Revelations, but especially in Paul, you get that too. He is always trying to weave the story of Jesus and just various ideas of Christology into what the prophets were saying or into the story of the Israelites. And sometimes he does it quite eloquently and interestingly, and sometimes not so much. But in any case, it is very, very concerned with the Old Testament, which is not what I was expecting. I had always had an idea in my head that the Old Testament and the New Testament were so violently opposed that you had to do some kind of mental acrobatics in order to make them work together. That's not necessarily the case. The Old Testament is a commentary on the New Testament is a commentary on the Old Testament with the idea that Jesus has modified the law of Moses, essentially. That's kind of the theme. But you find that even in the Gospels, Jesus is constantly, you get the sense that he is very, very aware of the Hebrew Scriptures, that is the Old Testament. He references them. And in fact, in perhaps the most moving moment in the entire Bible, certainly the most moving moment in the Gospels, Jesus' final words in the cross in the Gospel of Matthew are something like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is a deeply powerful thing for him to say, especially if you consider him God incarnate, right? So if God has incarnated himself in order to experience in order to experience human pain, the level of that pain that he's willing to go to is truly astonishing if he's willing to experience the sense of being forsaken by God, right? Like that is the deepest kind of pain you can imagine. So that, I think, amplifies the Christian interpretation of this. It's a beautiful, wonderful, moving moment that those are Jesus' last words. But then you remember that that is a direct quote of Psalm 22, which is in the Old Testament. So you do get the sense that Jesus is a Jewish preacher working in a very Jewish context. So really the entire New Testament, I think, has to be viewed, at least for me, in the context of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is a more satisfying reading experience as literature. So, boy, I really went on for quite a while longer than I expected on that one. But those are my thoughts on the New Testament. I hope I made sense. I hope I got everything in there that I wanted to talk about. I think I did. Again, don't mean any offense at all. But let me know what you guys think of this. I did love the reading of the Bible as an experience overall. Did prefer the Old Testament a little bit, but that's just me. Like I said, let me know what you guys think, and thank you for watching. Have a good day.